Welcome to the Unpacking the Framework video series. This series provides valuable information about the National Best Practice Framework for Early Childhood Intervention. My name is Denise Luscombe, and this video introduction is being recorded on Whadjuk Noongar Budja. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and the land you're listening from, and recognise their continued connection to country, waterways and community. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. This video is one of a series that describes the evidence and practice information that underpins the principles of the National Best Practice Framework for Early Childhood Intervention. You will hear from both national and international speakers throughout this video series. This video covers participation, a key principle of the National Best Practice Framework for Early Childhood Intervention, and is presented by our national speaker, Professor Christine Imms. Christine is the Apex Australia Foundation Chair of Neurodevelopment and Disability at the University of Melbourne and Director of Healthy Trajectories Child and Youth Disability Research Hub. Christine is an occupational therapist with a long-standing interest in participation and how to optimise participation outcomes for children and youth growing up with disability and their families.
Thank you for the introduction, and it is my absolute pleasure to be talking about the key principle of participation for the National Best Practice Framework for Early Childhood Intervention. This presentation has three sections. The first is what is the participation principle? The second is using the family of participation-related constructs as a guide for clinical reasoning. And the third is being participation-focused in practice. The participation principle is that optimising participation of children with developmental concerns, delay or disability and their families is everyone's business and a primary outcome of early childhood intervention for children, for families and for communities. Participation is involvement in a life situation that has two essential elements: attendance, which is defined as being there, being able to turn up in a life situation, and involvement, which is the experience of participation while attending. This might include elements of motivation or persistence, engagement, how you feel about things, and perhaps social connection if other people are there. Participation should always be considered within a family of participation-related constructs, because participation is always an outcome of the interactions between the individual and aspects of the environment and context. The next question is, participation in what? What do we mean by life situations? Now, these are the day-to-day activities that make up a life. Sometimes people talk about life situations by describing the setting, home, school, community, or the role, being a daughter, a son, a sibling, or a play partner, or the activity, mealtimes, playing, connecting. For children, the range and complexity of life situations increases as they get older, beginning in infancy, where those life situations are eat, sleep, play, and connect. Regardless of the life situation, attendance and involvement are universal dimensions of participation. You must attend in real life or virtually to be able to be involved, and you can be more or less involved when you do attend. Participation is always contextualised. It depends on person, context and environmental factors, and each of these can be the focus of interventions. And participation can be thought about in relation to individuals in their environments, interactions between people, or universal conditions for participation in society. So why is it important? The participation principle is important because fundamentally participation is a human right. But also, Patterns of participation influence health and well-being, both positively or negatively. Participation restrictions across the life course are known for people growing up with and living with a disability. They're a problem. Participation patterns start early in childhood, and seem rather stable. And there is evidence for participation-focused approaches to improve outcomes, but participation-focused approaches are not well embedded in practice or in community. Because we need to think about participation within a family of related constructs, it's important to have a good sense of what they are. When we have that, we can use this way of thinking to inform our planning and delivery of interventions. So I'm going to unpack the framework using participation in 3-year-old kindergarten as the example for a child with developmental concerns or disability. Remember though, this framework can apply to any activity or life situation and any individual, family or group. So if we think about participation as the life situation, it has 2 essential elements: attendance and involvement, that are situated within that family of related constructs. The first construct we'll talk about is the environment, because all participation is situated within an environment, which we talk about as being the broad, objective, physical and social structures in which we live. So if we think about Australia, what are the policies and structures around kindergarten? Who funds it? How much do parents have to pay? What is the organisational structure? What choices do families have about where to send their children, if any? And what are society's expectations about going to kindergarten? Should children go at 3 or should they not? Is it for socialisation? Is it for education? Childcare? Or all of those? These environmental factors can make it easy or hard for parents to access kinder. The next construct is context. So within our broad environments, participation happens in a closer context, which is the activity setting. The setting is made up of the place, people, objects, activity and time. So what might that look like in kindergarten? We can think about, where does it happen? How do people get there? What's the building like? What are the indoor and outdoor spaces like? Who's present? Of course children, but how many and how many adults? Who is usually there? Are other early childhood professionals welcomed, integrated, occasional visitors, or never there? What objects and activities are involved, and how are the activities structured and set up? And over what time frames is participation happening within a kindergarten session and over time? The context is the most important driver of opportunities for participation, so we need to think about it carefully. So now we put in the participation constructs, which I have said are attendance, which is being there. And you can think about attendance at the level of attending kinder. Does this child turn up to the sessions each week? And you can think about attendance within kinder. Is it possible for this child to attend each of the activities on offer at kinder, to be there in outdoor play or home corner or reading time? Involvement is the experience of participation, of being part of it while attending. If you can't attend, you can't be involved. But attending does not necessarily mean that a child is involved. Involvement in the activities of kindergarten is necessary for learning and for building a sense of belonging. The family participation-related constructs describes factors that are inside the person, and these are the attributes that each child brings to a life situation. And they are activity competence, which is the ability to do the activity to an expected standard. Does this child have the necessary skills for this life situation? Sense of self, which includes a growing perception of confidence, satisfaction in relation to the life situation. And preferences, which are the interests or activities that are meaningful or valued or enjoyed. What are the preferences of this child in relationship to kinder as a whole, or in particular aspects of the kindergarten program? These person factors are influenced by participation, and in turn they influence future participation. They're important to participation, but they are not participation. The person in the model portrays the self-regulating processes that develop over time. These are our executive processes that direct and organise our thinking, emotions, and actions. So these shapes are the core concepts in the family of participation related constructs framework, and all of these ideas are important to participation. But more important is how the concepts or shapes work together, because it is the transactions among aspects of the person and the context and environment that drives participation and development. The family of participation-related constructs describes many transactional exchanges among the concepts. Between participation and activity competence are the processes of acting and learning. Competence is an outcome of the child's actions. So they're learning the skills of an activity over time through participation. Activity competence is also a predictor or an enabler of future participation. Between sense of self and participation is the transaction of engaging and perceiving. The child's sense of self develops as a result of perceptions of the experience, a growing sense of what is satisfying to do, and knowledge of what I can do in that situation. The process between preferences and participations are choosing and complying. Children choose a preferred kinder activity or comply or cope with the choices made by others. The processes between those intrinsic constructs are also important. The child experiences a sense of competence or not in the life situation, which colours their sense of self as someone who can participate in this activity or situation to achieve what they want to, or indeed they can't. Between sense of self and preference is the process of interpreting. The interpretation of activity experiences in relation to the child's sense of self and their activity competence influences the development of their preferences. So it's through both the experience of participating in different life situations and the interpretation of that experience that preferences are formed for future participation. Very importantly, we also need to consider those processes between the environment, the context, and the child. The environment and context provide and regulate opportunities for participation, and the child responds and influences the context. And it's that transactional exchange that happens there, and both are changed, the child and the environment. The context and the environment are crucial to participation. We need to address difficulties in the environment very early. Maxwell and colleagues' 5 A's are a really helpful way to think about the impact of the context on participation. So for any activity or situation that a child or family need to or want to participate in, we need to ask ourselves, is it available to young children and their families? Does this situation actually exist in their local environment? And if it's available, is it accessible? Can both the parents access kinder and can the child access all aspects of the kinder program? Is it affordable in terms of time, effort and energy, not just money? Again, this is important for parents to support children to attend kinder, and within the program, the activities need to be within the child's available energy and effort so they can take part. So these 3 A's influence whether parents can get their children to kindergarten and whether the children can attend different activities within the kindergarten. Once in the life situation, the question is whether or not there can be adaptations and accommodations made to the situation within the kindergarten or changes to the environment so that those accommodations allow the child to have their needs met. And it's also important that those accommodations are acceptable to everybody in the situation. And it is these last 2 A's that influence the extent to which the child can be involved when attending kinder. So availability, accessibility, affordability influence attendance, and whether a situation is accommodating and acceptable influences involvement. So when we want to support participation, we need to consider the transactional influences because the personal attributes of preferences, sense of self and activity competence contribute to and are developed from participation experiences. And because participation occurs in an overarching environment and a close context, we need to think about the actions, resources, and processes that we need to make so that those activities and life situations are available, accessible, affordable, accommodating, and acceptable. So what should we do? How can we design early childhood interventions to optimise participation outcomes? An intervention process typically involves 6 steps. Assessment, so that we can define and understand the issues. Further assessment or exploration to find the explanations or the hypothetical causes of the problem. We need to prioritise and set goals. We need to choose or design an intervention to be used. We need to implement the intervention, and then we need to evaluate the implementation to see whether we did what we planned and whether it had the effect we were looking for. These processes are generic for all types of interventions, whether we're talking about individuals, groups, or populations. So step 1, understanding and defining the participation issue. So let's be clear. What is a participation problem? Well, it is too much or too little attendance, too much or too little involvement in a specific life situation or in the broad pattern of participation. And we also need to think about whose perspective is in focus. In young children, it is often parents and carers, but also children have a perspective, and so do other people who are in the life situation, like kindergarten staff. Perspectives differ between children, parents, and others. When exploring and assessing participation, be careful in the selection of your measures. There are valid and reliable measures of participation, although more of them measure attendance than involvement. On this list, all measure some aspect of attendance or frequency of doing something. 2 have good measures of involvement, and 3 are parent report, and 1 is observational. As soon as children can self-report, and there's evidence that can occur from around 5 years, they should be asked. Step 2, find the explanations of the participation issues or problems. The family of participation-related constructs can be used at this step, so possible explanations can relate to the child. We can think about activity competence, sense of self, preferences, and we can also, very importantly, think about the context, what's happening with the people, place, objects, activity, and time, and that broad environment. Usually, there are many explanations to a problem, and we usually look for explanations by doing assessments. Most assessment tools focus on assessing the child's body function or their activity performance. Often, we stop looking for explanations after we find some related to the child's motor, cognitive, or affective skills. But remember, participation is always an outcome of the transaction between the person and context, not one or the other. So the important message here is every explanation related to the child or person must be matched by an explanation related to the environment or context. Assessments of the context and environment are rarely used, but this information is essential for designing effective interventions. So choose your method of assessment wisely. What you measure is what you learn and focus on. And if you only assess the child, that's what you'll end up focusing on. Step 3 is to prioritise amongst problems, because usually there's more than one problem and rarely enough resources to focus on all of them at once. It's really important to discuss with carers and children as soon as they're old enough the consequences of prioritising a particular problem to address. How important is it to solve this problem, and to whom? The child, the carer, or the kindergarten? Remembering that people don't usually share the same priorities. How transient is the problem? Is it really specific in time or in context or a particular task? Transient problems are easier to understand and often easier to support and solve, but learning is more difficult to transfer. And the third question is, will solving this problem have a ripple effect on other problems? Once participation issues are prioritised, we can set goals. So at this step, step 3, we're making participation goals explicit in terms of both the type of goal it is and the effect we are looking at. So goal setting takes time, and it's a key part of the intervention process. So it's very important that it doesn't just happen inside the therapist or the professional's head. It needs to happen collaboratively with children and families. So if we remember that participation goals are always about attendance and involvement, where the problem is too much or too little attendance or involvement, and the goal is where that issue no longer exists. Carers and children's active involvement in goal setting is really crucial for working towards ultimate goals, so that they actually take charge of solving their own participation concerns. Scaling goals, so working out what success looks like with carers and with children, provides a really concrete opportunity to talk about expectations about what the intervention will change or deliver. Step 4 is about designing the intervention. And the intervention is usually based on the explanations, and most problems have more than one explanation. Explanations are used to generate the methods. And methods that concern the body or activity performance must be always supplemented with environment and context methods. So if, for example, we're thinking about Sarah and her participation problem, which is that she rarely plays with peers in outdoor activities at prep, then some of the explanations might be that Sarah's motor impairment makes it difficult for her to walk and climb. Sarah doesn't have a mobility aid adapted for use in the outdoor play space. Or staff have not created outdoor activities that don't require mobility skills. And the time allocated to outdoor activities perhaps is not long enough for Sarah to get there and become involved. So each of these explanations needs to be considered as a potential target for intervention. And children, caregivers and providers in the context are usually the experts on the characteristics of the environment where the activity takes place. So collaboration and designing participation interventions is highly effective. This list shows examples of evidence-based participation interventions, and more programs are in development. There are evidence-based programs for those as young as preterm infants, and they go across the life course. So step 5 is implementing the intervention. Participation goals concern participation in everyday activities. That means participation interventions are primarily implemented in everyday activity settings. And this has implications for service structures and professional roles. To date, professional strategies for implementing interventions in everyday settings has not been well researched, but current evidence tells us that the role of the professional is going to be coach or mentor, and that there's likely to be multiple partners involved in delivering successful interventions. When we're implementing the intervention, everyone usually knows whether a method is useful in an everyday setting within a short time, within a few days of trying it. Effective interventions are usually those that are easy to perform, fit well in the context, and can be modified. Parents, children, and others in the setting can modify the methods if they know what the active ingredients are. What were the explanations that led to the active ingredients actually will then help parents and others understand how those explanations and methods go together. The role of the professional then is to check in early before parents, the child, and others have abandoned the intervention method, and to support them to learn about how to adapt what is needed to be able to apply the method. Evaluating is step 6. Did we do what we planned to do? So that's evaluating the process. And then the outcome. Have we met our participation goal? We can also need to think about participation in the intervention process, because children with disability are rarely involved in only one intervention. In fact, they typically experience multiple interventions across the life course. We know that active involvement in the intervention is associated with better outcomes, but what steps of the intervention process are children and carers usually involved in? Perhaps with identifying the problem, though sometimes this is confused with explaining the problem, maybe with prioritising, and then with implementing the intervention. The other steps are often invisible to children and sometimes to parents and to other supporters as well. However, active participation in the intervention process is an important way for parents and children and others to build knowledge about how the environment and the child's abilities affect their participation. And it's also a strategy for reaching ultimate goals and enduring participation effects through learning to reason about participation. In the family of participation-related constructs, the blobs or the concepts are not as important as the arrows. Understanding the transactions is crucial because they are the entry points for intervention. It's really common that we only pay attention to the transaction between acting and learning. But the others are just as important to the participation experience and arguably more important to overall development, sense of belonging, and well-being. Participation is a transactional phenomenon. It's happening all the time, from birth throughout life. Learning for life is done by living your life. So for every life situation, we need to consider our approaches to supporting attendance and involvement of children with developmental concerns, delay or disability, and their families in a broad range of life situations. Our patterns of participation are shaped by age, culture, community, family, and repeated experiences. One or a few bad participation experiences are usually not a problem, but repeated experiences where you either cannot attend or when you do you cannot be involved create serious problems for development, for sense of self, for health and for well-being. There's growing evidence that participation patterns are established very early and are therefore thereafter rather stable. Early childhood might be the most important time in a child's life to support participation across multiple life situations. So participation is attendance and involvement in meaningful and purposeful life situations. It's living a good life. I need to finish by saying that I never do anything alone, and this is a very inadequate list of the people who I collaborate with on participation-focused research. There are many people that I work with, and I name just a few, and in particular I want to acknowledge Matt Scranland. Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this video, part of the video series Unpacking the Framework for the National Best Practice Framework for Early Childhood Intervention. The review of best practice in early childhood intervention was commissioned by the Department of Social Services. Led by the University of Melbourne, the project team included PRECI, professionals and researchers in early childhood intervention, Murdoch Children's Research Institute, SNAICC, National Voice for Our Children, Children and Young People with Disability Australia, and ACD, Advocating for Children with Disability. Coordination and production of the video series was led by PRECI.